So I asked a really important question before we all joined, and it was rather than asking people, how are you? It's really about asking, that great connection that we have, the commiserating over the weather. But whenever we stop, whenever we ask someone, oh, what's the weather like there? Perhaps we need to stop and ask ourselves, what are our internal weather patterns like? And, for those of you that haven't met me before, my life, so 22 years ago, I put my head down on my desk. I got up and walked into my boss's office and said, Mike, I'm going off on stress leave. And Mike looked at me with just shock because he said, but Cindy, we didn't know there was a problem. You're always so busy taking care of everyone else. And you see, that's the shadow side of being passionate and being and loving what we do. Perhaps it's a cultural norm or it's an expectation of ourselves that we take care of everyone else and put ourselves last. And that's my life mission, is to turn that upside down and examine it through a different lens. So I love hearing from you, but I'm going to encourage you right now to turn off your notifications, to put your cell phone away, turn it on to vibrate and turn that screen over, because at this point in this event in our lives, where our attention goes, our energy flows, and we only have so much energy, we only have so much bandwidth to go. So when we think of, what is it that we already do? What is it? What would you do with an extra half an hour a day? And please use the chat function. What would you do with an extra half an hour a day? And what do you already do that you could do an extra half hour a day? Because we only get 24 hours in a day. Nobody gets 25, but every choice that we make, every action we take is in fact a vote, an internal vote for the person that we want to be or the person that we want to become. So, whether it's you want to nap, whether you want to craft, whether you want to spend time outdoors, whether you want to, spend time with people that fill you up, whether you want to read more, whatever it is, we need to make that a priority in our lives. Because again, when it comes back to our bandwidth and how much we have, there's a difference between being stressed and there's a difference between being overwhelmed. And when we look at the Freudenberger's description of burnout from 1975, where he talked about staff burnout syndrome, that was emotional exhaustion, the fatigue that comes from caring too much for too long. Depersonalization, the depletion of empathy, caring, and compassion, and that decreased sense of accomplishment. And I've heard it from every industry. There's that unconquering sense of futility that nothing you do makes any difference. So what do we need to do? I can spend all day talking about what's wrong, but we need to talk about what the solutions are. So it's as if our engine has been revved up. It's been in high rev for way too long. And when we stop and we need to be really clear about what our external stressors are. And it can be really easy to blame work. It can be really easy to blame finances. It can be really easy to blame time or the cultural norms and or those expectations. And it can be about fear, and that fear is real or it's imagined. And this is where our mind and our body cannot tell the difference between real and imagined fears. So when we're constantly focusing on work, because those boundaries are blurred, there's no longer that separation. And we can't wait for someone else to give us permission to take our lunch or to take our break or to turn our computer off at a certain time so that we can be present for the other people in our lives. We need to give ourselves permission. And this speaks to boundaries. This speaks to making choices. And back to that phrase, every choice we make is a vote for the person that we want to be. So there are external stressors, and then there are also internal stressors. And when we think of communication, when we think of words and how words matter, now, I think that we have a crisis in confidence. We've lost our confidence in a lot of the external support systems that we used to take for granted. But there's also those internal support systems. And when we get caught up in that whirlpool, the hurricane, as someone so eloquently put, we can beat ourselves up. And that criticism, if we're just constantly, I need to, I always do this, I never do this. We need to right size that, because just as bad as those external stressors, so our stress response came from, when our brain was developing back in our evolutionary history. And, the threat is no longer the saber-toothed tiger. The threat is that person sitting across the table from you. The threat is this invisible virus. So if we just don't have the language to appreciate, the language to, basically the language of self-care, then what happens is our body is interpreting ourselves as a threat. So our mind is working against us. So when we're so tied to our identity and this managing this perception of who we are, and we know that leaders, the people that show up and they can create a psychologically safe place for us where we can have real conversations around how hard this is. And perhaps you start off at the beginning of the week with the oomph, with the pizzazz. And then by Thursday, it's accumulation of external stressors. And on top of that, you have the internal stressors because your expectations of yourself are way out of line. And we need to remember that this is trauma, and a new trauma opens the door to past traumas. And we may be judging someone, we may be judging ourselves. This is real. So when we get caught up in, worry about the future, when we, check our emails before we go to bed at night, and then our mind is just whirling with all of the things that we didn't do, we forgot to do, or the latest one that I've heard is someone replies to an email and we look at our original email and we don't remember even writing it. Because our ability to retain information, our ability to process information, we just don't have the bandwidth. So when we look at some of the contributing factors, and there's not one, there's not one factor, and sometimes it's our personalities, perhaps we have that perfectionistic gene, or we have that helper gene. But it can be lack of something. So it can be lack of control over outcomes because there's no such thing as a small choice anymore. We're realizing just how little control we have over so many things. When we don't have autonomy, and when we think about motivation in the workplace, when we have the autonomy to make decisions, that's where creativity blossoms. And resources, we tend to think of resources as people or money, but resources can be energy. And when we lose that sense of shared meaning and purpose because we're not sitting with our coworkers, we're not connecting with them in the way that we used to, that can be another lack in our lives. And again, when we don't have, when we have no say in our schedule or in the flexibility. And then, it can also be the excess of. So an excess of people controlling us or us thinking that we need to control. And those of us that have that responsibility gene, that responsibility gene where we believe that we're responsible for everyone and everything. Underneath that is, we need to pay attention to ourselves, and what's driving that responsibility and what triggers it is when other people aren't being responsible. So we may be seeing people, we may think that others are micromanaging us, and we need to remember that everyone has a job to do. And yes, you may have told someone that you already completed it, but guess what? They may not, they're just not retaining it. So what about conflict in our lives? Conflict tells us, it shows us that something needs to change. And whenever there's a scarcity of resources, there is going to be conflict. But conflict left unresolved, it's like the backpack that we're carrying that is just weighing us down because it's got all of these rocks in it. And they used to be pebbles and now they're boulders. And we can feel that physical exhaustion from unresolved conflict. And it might even be the conflict within yourself of whether you take a vacation, whether you ask to go down to a 4-day work week so that you have the bandwidth to deal with your other commitments in life. And then there can be, that competition when we believe that we're in competition with others, when we're competing with others, and when it's destructive. Some competition can be healthy. It helps us to do better and be better. But when it's just destroying our self-worth, that's when it needs to change. And then for those of us that grew up in homes where self-sacrifice was the model, where perhaps we had martyr mothers, sorry, Mom, or in the workplace where, workaholism is the motivation. It used to be the person that arrived at the office before their boss, or the one that stayed until, that was the last person to leave. But it's even more insidious now with technology, and we can see when people are online and when they aren't. And back a few months ago, I talked about work-life harmony. And it's not necessarily about complete balance, isn't it? It's about having the time, the energy to meet our priorities. And if we don't make ourselves and our families a priority, then guess what happens? We run into neglect. And you see, caregiver syndrome is really another insidious one. It's not just people that work in healthcare. I was presenting to a group of healthcare professionals last week, and boy, oh boy, I had that crisis of confidence when I hung up, because I thought, there they are on the front lines, and here I am in my safe little office. Who am I to tell them about burnout? Who am I to give them advice? But you see, what I come back to over and over again is the common denominator, the interconnectedness, is that we're all humans. And we may not even think of ourselves as caregivers. We may call it, oh, I'm just being a good daughter. I'm just being a parent. I'm just being a responsible son. And we don't even realize that we're responsible for the care of someone else. And we can't give from an empty well. And that's why burnout is rampant. And when we neglect our own physical, mental, emotional, and social needs, that's when those are all of the things that we need to give us the fuel to keep on going. So I'm going to stop for a minute. And I'm just going to ask you to, and if you want to share it in the chat function, you can send it privately to me, or you can, I think a host and panelists it'll come to, or you can just sit for a minute and reflect on, and don't judge your answers. So let's take a couple of deep breaths. Let's feel that air come in to our nostrils. Let's feel it go all the way down and then all of the way out again. Let's take 3 deep cleansing breaths. And now just turn away from your computer with your eyes closed. And as I ask this question, what is lacking in my life? What is there an excess of in my life? What in my life is being neglected? And as you come back to the presentation, this is a question that we need to keep on asking because it's going to change. And again, we keep on running on old, outdated software. And this isn't about blaming, this is about identifying. And it's also about accepting. We can't change the past, but when we can accept our limitations, accept accept where we are today, it doesn't mean that we have to like it. But when we spend so much time and energy, when we spend so much of our resources focused on things we have absolutely no control over, then we just keep on cycling through lack of, excess of, and neglect. So spending time that just stopping a couple of times a day and taking a couple of deep breaths and asking ourselves, what am I feeling? What are my thoughts? What thought patterns are contributing to these feelings? Also, when we can separate the difference between being stressed, when we evaluate the environment demand is beyond our ability to cope successfully, because a certain amount of stress is good for us. A certain amount of stress motivates us. It keeps us on track. It's about being human. But when we're overwhelmed, our emotional and our cognitive intensity is so high, it's to the point of feeling that we're unable to do the next right thing. And that is when we need to do nothing. That's when we need to just walk away and we need to reset. And whether we can physically get up and walk away, or whether we can just turn off our screen and sit there and do a body scan, or bring our awareness back into our body because we spent so much time in our minds. But if we stop and we look at our stress responses, when it's our fight response, it may show up as being irritated or annoyed. I'm seeing a lot of that these days. And if we can deal with that irritation and that annoyance before it becomes frustrated, anger, and completely enraged, then we have more. We're not fighting. And then that flight response, when we become unsure, when we're worried, when we're anxious, when we're scared, and again, a certain amount of anxiety, a certain amount of fear is healthy. But when we get to that point where we're terrified, and then we go into freeze, and freeze is like the burnout phase, where we're totally disengaged, when we're not showing up with our authentic self, when we're sitting there and we feel like the lights are on, but nobody's home, when we're immobilized, when we just can't pull, where we can't approach, avoid, we're just stuck right in wherever it is we are. And that stuck may be repeating certain thoughts, continuous pattern of thoughts. And then when we're numb, and sometimes we choose behaviors that numb us out. But see, the thing with numbing those hard emotions, I almost said bad, didn't I? And my whole new mindset is that there are no good or bad emotions. Emotions are data. They're here to serve us. They tell us. They're signals of what we need to do. But if we're numbing, either through what we're ingesting with our eyes, our ears, or our mouth, then we're disconnected from ourselves. And then it's like our operating system just shuts down. All of the red lights were blinking way back, and suddenly it just goes out. So it's about knowing where you are, because stress has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But when we're caught up in burnout, we can't see the end. We can't see the tunnel. And I just love this photo. I used it last week when I was talking about change. And, when we stop and think about what does it mean to be resilient, or when you think about a time in your life where you were resilient. So some of the words to describe resilience are buoyant, strong, supple, able to roll with the punches, quick to recover from the stressors. We're pliable, we're adaptable. Those chameleon-like qualities where we can adapt to situations. But what's the opposite of resilience? Stiff. When we're not aware of what our body is absorbing, that's when we become stiff and rigid. But we can also be rigid and inflexible in our thought patterns, or in our judgments, or in our preferences. And, again, that delicate, weak, and vulnerable, we often see being vulnerable as being a sign of weakness, but we can take that and we can turn it around and look at it as a sign of stress. When you think of that image of that little, that piece of grass that grows up in the middle of a crack in the pavement. So why do we need? The good news is that we can become more resilient, and no matter where we are, we can make different choices. And it's about completing the stress cycle. And when we have continuous stressors, we need to be creative. We need to find new ways. So in order to complete that stress cycle, what it does is our mind, our body, and we can no longer see them as separate, need to know that you survived the threat, that your body is a safe place to be. So what do you do to manage your stress? Let's stop. Let's take a deep breath. What do you do to manage your stress? And it doesn't have to be a long walk, just getting up and walking away from your desk. Noticing when you want to run, when you're, in a hurry, and slowing it down. Doing puzzles. And this is an interesting one. So this is great, because that's where I went to 2 years ago, was, doing puzzles. And then when I was at my an osteopath appointment, he said that can access a stress response as well. So it can access that stress response, is that, we're looking for that place that it fits. And then the anxiety or the stress that comes up when we realize that we've lost a piece. Crafts, music, singing, working out, running, cycling, knitting, keep them coming in. We need to have an intervention. It's a stress intervention, playing games. What else? And this is back to my original question for those that just joined. My very first slide was, what would you do with an extra half hour a day? Or what do you already do that you could do an extra half hour a day? Because the thought of doing something for an hour or 2 hours, or maybe we even need to break it down into a half hour being 3 10-minute chunks. So all of those things that you say you already do, we need to do more of them. So these are the strategies. Okay, and you're going to go into breakout rooms after this so that you can come up with more strategies. So physical activity tells the mind and the body that you survived the threat. But can you see how when you sit at your desk and you don't get up and walk away, or you're fearful of walking away because something might come in, how our body is still in the stress mode? And if we tell ourselves that work is the stress, then we're still attached to it. So we need to have those, what was the word that we used to use? The demarcation points. And then breathing. Our breath signals to us that we're in a relaxation response. So when we're inhaling, that's the sympathetic nervous system. But when we're exhaling, that's the parasympathetic. So when you inhale, breath work, set a timer for a minute, find what your natural breath is, and then see if you can cut it back. So if your natural breath input and output is, 6 breaths in a minute, see if you can pull that back to 4. And your inhale needs to be, your exhale needs to be twice as long as your inhale. So if you inhale to a count of 4, you want to exhale to at least a count of 6, if not 8. And then social interaction, and finding different ways to interact. And then what's your relationship with laughter? What's your relationship with fun? And we're going to have a real talk about that. And then affection. Did you know that a 20-second hug or a 20-second kiss or sitting and petting an animal for 20 seconds, that's affection. So it helps to raise those cortisol levels, those feel-good hormones. And I was talking to a friend the other day about this, and I said, I don't even know when the last time I kissed my husband was, other than just the air kiss, because we've been so concerned about droplets and spray. So Valentine's Day is coming. So, the research into pet therapy, into hugging, and sometimes we just need to put our hands, at our ribs, and we need to take a couple of deep breaths, and we need to press our hands in to our rib cage and feel that. And again, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, a couple of times an hour. Again, what it's doing, it's releasing those feel-good hormones. And then creative expression. This is back to the craft, to the painting, but it's not about perfection. It's about creativity, left brain, right brain. And we need to marry the two of them. And then how do you release emotions? Sometimes we need to put on, someone said, put on that playlist, the playlist that motivates us when we're feeling like we need to have the energy to be on top of the game. Like if I stand here and I awfulize and catastrophize about my presentations before I come into them, guess what happens? I'm in a stress response. But when I can walk around singing to, music that uplifts me, and it's even better when we sing out loud rather than just hearing it, then I show up, I've got a different energy. And some of you, my apologies to those of you that have heard this before. And if you hear yourself saying, I already know this, ask yourself, when was the last time you did it? But for those of you that are new to my presentations, we need to, when we've got all of that emotion coursing through our bodies, sometimes we need to just stand up and we need to shake. We need to shake it off, cathartic shaking, or perhaps we need a dance intervention. And we need to dance around our office or our kitchen. And if you can do it with someone else, it's even better. Because what we need to do is we need to move that energy around. Because stuck emotion has physical manifestations. And there are many different diagnoses these days that in my life I wasn't attached to, because I knew it was about emotion that needed to find a new root. So Stephanie's going to put you into breakout rooms. And for the next 10 minutes, Stephanie, we can set the timer for 10 minutes, okay? And that includes the wait time. And if you're finished before that 10 minutes, just leave the breakout room and come back to the main room. I'll be here waiting for you. But I want you to come up with as many strategies as you can for each of these categories. And don't second guess yourself. Don't criticize. Don't compare. Just come up with as many as you can. Okay, I had a really hard time in that. I started looking at my life, and these last 2 years, I've become really rigid. I've become really inflexible, and I stopped and I did a fun audit. And I'm going to encourage you to do this later, to give yourself time, to give yourself space to remember a time when you were having fun. Who were you with, and what were you doing? And then come up with the characteristics of your fun. Because for me, if there's competition, if there's the chance that anyone is going to get hurt, if there's a winner or a loser, that's not fun. But when I stopped and I reflected on this and I remembered the times that I was having fun, there was a connection, there was a playfulness. I was just asking Stephanie's daughter what she does for fun. She had all kinds of answers. She even wanted to show me her paintbrush. And there's flow. We lose time. We stop worrying. So your goal is to do a fun audit and come up with what's anti-fun for you, and then to come up with what's fun and put that right into your calendar. Because we need to take care of our mental and emotional well-being. And this comes to these internal belief system, and believing that your life has meaning, knowing and using hope as a strategy, that there's hope for a better tomorrow, or there's hope for a better afternoon after you have shut down your computer and you've gotten up and walked for 5 minutes. Ask yourself, what fills me up? Because continuous self-development and growth, and this has been another growth opportunity, an AGO. And then perhaps we need to look at our social connections, and perhaps we need to engage more with the people that fill us up rather than the ones that just deplete us. And resilience, it speaks to our belief in ourselves to overcome adversity, that we have the agency, that we have the bandwidth to be able to deal with it, whatever is right in front of us. And perhaps we need to do a values audit. And we need to know what our values are so that we can have that sense of purpose. Because rather than focusing on productivity, what we need to focus on is connecting. You know, that psychological safety, that mutual sense of trust, and a connected sense of knowing. And when you find that you're sad, angry, when you find that your confidence is low, that's when you need to connect. That's when you need to connect to what is your purpose in life. So spending time, perhaps the next 10 minutes, identifying what your physical, emotional, mental, and career limits are. And identifying what your values and your dreams are, your dreams, your hope, your aspirations. Tuning into your feelings and asking yourself, what is this here to tell me? And giving yourself permission, writing out a permission slip to yourself to say yes, no, or not yet. To be in the gap, in the gap of not knowing. To communicate, and again, words matter, how we talk to ourselves, how we talk to others, and would we talk to someone that reports to us the same way we talk to ourselves? And this again comes down to the crisis of confidence that we're having right now. And knowing and doing are two different things. We may know what we need to do, but we need to schedule that time in there. We need to be aware of what the distractions are that repeatedly show up in your life. And then we need to seek support. We may need to seek outside help. And there is no shame in asking for help. As a matter of fact, it's a sign of strength. And Dale Carnegie, like how many years ago, wrote in one of his books, I've got it on the next slide, but he talked about, just for today. And just for today, I will try to live through this day only and not tackle all of my problems at once. I will adjust to what is and not try to adjust everything to my own desires. I will try to strengthen my mind. I will study. I will learn something useful. I will do somebody a good turn and not get found out. And guess what? If that person finds out, or if you feel that need to want to take credit for it, we need to do something else. You do two things that you don't want to do, whether it's getting up and walking or saying no to something that you don't want to do. And you'll be happy. And he says that this assumes to be true what Abraham Lincoln said, that most folks are as happy as they make up their minds to be. And when we're caught up in hurry, when we're caught up in indecision, because we don't have the bandwidth, stop, do nothing. Reset, recharge, and give yourself permission to have a half hour of quiet time, so all by yourself, so that you can relax. And there are many different times of relaxation, and it's about gaining perspective on our lives. And then when we're caught up in that stress response, we're constantly looking for what's wrong, what needs to change, but perhaps we need to, come back and ask ourselves, what do I need to change? Instead of trying to change everybody out there, what do I need to change? So our wrap-up question, or our wrap-up statement is, and for those of you that need to go on to something else, give yourself permission to go. It's okay. Again, where attention goes, energy flows. If we're sitting here and our mind is always on the next thing, give yourself permission. So what do you, for today, what do you release the need for in your life? Because this is the first step of habit change. And this is what all of these sessions are about. They're about changing habits. And when we get so focused on the habit, on the goal, we need to focus more on the processes. And we're going to talk more about that next week. So, what do you release the need for in your life? For me, it's about releasing the fear of missing out. Yes. Yes. For me, I release the need for perfectionism. I release the need for control. I release the need of knowing all of the answers. Stephanie and I were talking in our breakout room about how we make decisions today based on the information we have. And when that information changes, you make a different choice, but don't stay hanging on to the old one. So some additional resources, everything that I talked about today came from here.